every store has a bottom drawer or a back cupboard that is overflowing with frames that are being given back, broken frames, temples, things like that. And, being in Australia, having to import everything that we use, I'm like, well, we have all this material here. With Objekt, we're trying to show you that participating in sustainability doesn't have to be cheap. It doesn't have to be bad quality or anything special. It can just be something that is part of the frame and the manufacturing process that is just normal at some point in time.
Welcome to The Focused View, the podcast for eye care professionals across Australia. Brought to you by Opticare. In each episode, we bring together leading eye care, optical and business professionals to share valuable insights, practical tips, and the latest trends shaping the optical business landscape. I'm your host, Michael Nasser, and together we'll explore innovative strategies for practice growth, patient care, and business success in the eye care industry. Whether you're starting your career, managing a practice, or just looking to stay ahead of the field, The Focused View is your source for inspiration and knowledge.
Chris, welcome to the show. Really excited to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me, Michael.
Those that don't know you, and to the benefit of the audience, can you tell us a bit about your background and what initially drew you to the optical industry?
Yeah, look, I kind of fell into the optical industry by accident. I was a 21-year-old working in restaurants and bars, and one of the guys who frequented the restaurant was running some optometry practices and involved with Budget Eyewear. And he turned up one day and he said, you should come and do a trial shift for me at Budget Eyewear. And I said, sure, why not? Walked into the store and it was in the days when all stores kind of had edging. Budget Eyewear stores got to pick their own frames. So it was the whole thing from, the retail social aspect, the design frame aspect, and then getting to play with tools and machines out the back. And I remember once I walked through there and I got the tour, I was like, oh, this is cool. I think I might do this. So from that point, I basically started working for Budget Eyewear down in Canberra. So
what was it about that job that you liked the most, sort of getting into it and it being, I guess, a new profession, not having done it before and having your first experience with it?
I think it was the variety. So I'd been studying architecture and design for many years and walking in kind of seeing the frames and thinking, if someone's designing those, I wonder whether that's something I could get into. And then going out the back and, we had an old, it was a Hoytech, I think it was like a H100 or something, where you had to move the lens from different wheel to different wheel to do the finishing. And that really appealed to me as well. So I kind of got the idea that you could, you do sales, you're talking with people, you're interacting, but then there's this whole other side of optics behind the scenes, which is not just about the store. It's, it's machines, which I love, and design as well. So
you mentioned this design background and something that was quite passionate for yourself. When you started at Budget, having that design element within you, how did that shape your approach to eyewear craftsmanship and I guess the frame component of the industry?
I think for me, I was pretty lucky because it was at the same time as the silhouette Titan minimal art had come out. So, I was working with some really great dispensers who were trained, optical mechanics, and customers would come in and they would see a frame shape. They loved the TMA concept, but they might have wanted a larger size or a different shape or whatever else. And the guys I was working with were like, well, there's no restrictions because there's no frame on it. You can sketch up a shape for the customer and we can show you how to align all the holes and kind of customize it. So that really kind of appealed to me and kind of reaffirmed to me that, well, I can use some of my design background in this job, and it's more than just a retail job, and also, learning when you're doing, architecture and design, you're doing a lot of mathematics and things like that, and working with lenses, and there's huge amounts of mathematics in that, what base curve, what lens thickness, what power combos, things like that, to get the best result out of the frame and lens and the prescription.
You mentioned about the silhouette TMA. I'm not very familiar with that. And, for the people that aren't, what was that initiative? And I guess if you can speak to that, because it seemed to be somewhat influential with, I guess, in the early stages of your career there.
It was. So the TMAs were, Silhouette came up with a new patented, it's a pretty common form of fitting now, a way of fitting the wireframe to the lenses. So typically a rimless frame, you would have screw holes through the front of the lens, and that would screw with a nut and bolt to the temple and the bridge piece. So you had this quite kind of prominent features bridge in the trim area. And of course, the nature of screws is they come loose, wear out at a time. And Silhouette came up with this amazing kind of plug fitting system. So you had a little plastic plug that would slip in the back, which was really, really small. It was very subtle, like kind of about 4 mils by maybe 1.5 to 2 mils. And then you had a little barbed prong on a very fine piece of wire that compressed into the plug through the lens. And so it held it in place. And you had just this very minimal, very subtle kind of little detail of the frame on the lens. And the rest of it was just pretty much you, the person. And it was pretty revolutionary at the time. It was super lightweight and very comfortable, and yeah, it's great.
You mentioned that you had interest in becoming an architect, and I guess it sort of draws on the design component, which obviously has been quite prominent for yourself. How do you think that creative aspiration influenced your approach to frame design?
When I was kind of moving towards becoming an architect, I feel a little bit like George Costanza saying that, I was really drawn to the way that some of the designers, Frank Lloyd Wright and things, would incorporate, natural elements when they were designing houses, waterfalls in the house, building off the sides of really steep blocks and following the contours and things. And so that real kind of artistic, creative element was big for me when I was thinking about becoming an architect. And as I started, I think I was really lucky at the time that I started in optics, because technology was improving. There was different forms of manufacturing coming on board, and designers and manufacturers starting to incorporate really creative artistic elements into frame design and manufacturing. So what had turned me off becoming an architect as a profession was the fact that there was so much kind of focus actually on, really simple renovations and carports and things like that. But all of a sudden you had this movement in the industry that I was kind of falling into, where they were really picking up that element and running with creating textures, wood grain finishes, right, using different materials to make frames. And the lenses were being innovated at the same kind of pace. So all of a sudden, you could make a frame that didn't have a standard 6-base face form curve, and you could get a lens that would fit into it and work. So you had this kind of almost blank canvas to be more creative with the eyewear.
I guess it speaks to a side of the industry that we all know of, and I guess experience when it comes to frames, and obviously how important they are to the practice and obviously the patient as well. But having that design awareness and then adding to that is extremely powerful and really interesting. And it's not something that is discussed. And it sort of leads me to my next question, because currently in the profession, the world is basically dominated by mass production, I think it's fair to say. And that's not just in our industry, in many, but for ours in particular, when you look at the international players and the big brands, and we're all familiar as to who they are, this concept of handcrafted and craftsmanship, it's really unique, and it makes this type of eyewear stand out. Why is it so important to maintain artisanal practices in frame design, in your opinion?
I think it's because you're dealing with people. People like to be individual. They like to have a style that's theirs, something that's kind of signature to their personality. So when you're producing something on a mass scale, you're producing one style and you might be producing 10,000 or 100,000 units. There's not a lot of scope to individualize that, because everything counts to the cost of the frame, to the end result, and how it's going to be purchased and things. 5 cents on a hinge is a lot when you talk about 10,000 hinges. And it's like a train mass production, because to slow it down, to make changes, to adjust for 1 or 2 people it's just not going to happen. It's just the train is running. To use an analogy, when you go from a big locomotive to a single carriage, you can stop that and make a change. So when you've got what is happening at the moment, which is this real kind of increase in boutique, small batch production, kind of a return to, shops having the capacity to make one-offs for clients, you've got this capacity that mass production just doesn't have. So, the person who comes in and who has a wider face or a more petite face, or absolutely loves color or texture, or has a strong prescription, any number of reasons why they might want something that is individual for them, you have that capacity to do that. So if you lose artisanal kind of small batch production, you lose that capacity to connect with the customer who wants a piece just for them. And I think for me, I started in Sydney when I was making frames and things like that. And I was going, I want to really push this and do this properly. I would rent spaces in creative warehouses where you would have painters and ceramicists, digital artists, fine furniture makers, a spectacle maker, all of that. And I really saw just how many people really wanted to have access to something that was unique to them. And so looking at the industry that I've been in and, the increase of capacity to do customizable lenses that suited to the person's face shape, prescription, how they wore the glasses and things like that, it just made sense that you could also match that with a frame that suited them, their personality.
It's funny when you mention it, how obvious that sort of answer is too, but how we forget that, right? Like, I mean, in our industry, pretty much if you've got a script for lenses, more often than not, it's individual to yourself. And obviously that's to correct the correction that needs to be made with the lenses or with your vision in that regard. But with frames, it's almost the same thing. But, from the point of view of people are individual too, and there are people that want to highlight that, and I'm starting to see a lot more of that too. I've become observant of that with regards to eyewear and how important it is, and how some people in particular really want to stand out and create their own pieces. And then you sort of draw on the fact there that you'd be in workspaces with other makers of types, and it's like, well, it's almost the same thing. You are creating something that is in some ways a form of art and a piece of art. And so, to have that, I guess, that level of passion to connect those two is powerful. And then that individualism with regards to that is really powerful. And I guess it speaks sort of, being independent and focused. And I always sort of fall back on that. It sort of epitomizes, independence as well to some capacity, because it allows you to be individual and to be yourself and to create something that's totally unique and bespoke and to that person. So as you say, it just resonates so much with me. So it makes total sense. What challenges do you face in small batch production, and how do you ensure sustainability? Because I know sustainability is also really important to you, and we're going to get to a few other initiatives that you've created and been a part of with regards to that. But how do you face those challenges, and how do you ensure that sustainability remains at the heart of the process?
That's a really good one, because certainly when I first started making frames, and I was like, I want to make one-off frames, and this was kind of 15, 16 years ago, maybe actually a little bit longer. The internet was running, it was great. E-commerce stores were popping up, but it was still expensive to set up an e-commerce store. It was still tens of thousands of dollars. So it was really interesting when I first started, Facebook was still kind of in its infancy as well too. Social media was fairly raw. So, you would ring these companies or contact companies who were supplying materials and parts and components to big factories, and they'd say, yeah, sure. How many do you want? And I'd say, can I get 10? And they'd say, how about 1,000 or how about 10,000? And that was really challenging, because it was both challenging actually and positive, because the challenge was all of a sudden you're like, well, there's no way I can afford 10,000 of this component, this hinge or this material. But then it turned you around and you go, okay, well, what are my alternatives to kind of create that? And I'm a big believer in a thing called cognitive evolution. And at that same time, what cognitive evolution is, which is basically the theory that, the world evolves at a steady pace, whether you're, a monkey in Africa and a monkey in South America. Often they started kind of stripping bamboo in the same way, but they didn't have connection. And what I found was that there were actually a lot of other people like me around the world who were like, we want to make, 100 pieces a year or 500 pieces a year. So slowly, as I started getting into it, these other people were connecting through social media and different ways. And some of the companies in France and China and Japan and Italy were like, well, where are we? We've got these materials. Well, what's to stop us from breaking it down from, 1,000 minimum order to 10 to work with these guys? So all of a sudden websites popped up where you could order small batches of components and materials. And, you're communicating with people. So, I might order a whole bunch of really cool red, and my colleague over in the US is like, geez, I'd love a little bit of red. I've got some, heap of black. How about we do a trade? So all of a sudden you had this community where you had access to information, materials, and that really kind of increased our ability to kind of navigate the challenges that we had first kind of come across. And that has phenomenally grown over the last 7 to 10 years. It's crazy. So now there are manufacturers of machines who make them specifically for small batch production, as well as suppliers of parts and, materials, which is fantastic. And if I can come back to the positives, I guess, of the challenge. I've always been pretty heavily into kind of what I like to call resource recovery. So where I was brought up, we always had a bunch of wood that we might one day use sitting in the garage, boxes of old screws that we might one day use sitting in the garage kind of thing. And so that kind of switched on to me. I didn't have access to temples. I had access to a lot of interesting broken frames and things like that I could use parts from, which is what I did a lot of in the early days. And a friend of mine's dad came across some old broken church pews, and he was like, "Do you want them? You can, make something from them." And I was like, "Well, hang on a second. Here's this material. I can use these, beautiful antique cedar wood and carve that and create temples for the frames." And because I had a whole bunch of frame fronts that were kind of pre-made. So, I started carving and learning to laminate this beautiful wood into making the temples for the frames. It was about kind of being considerate of what resources I had access to rather than that being thrown out. My mate's dad was like, "Here you go." And, I didn't have access to heaps of materials and hinges, but I had access to the bottom drawer that every optometrist had, which has, hundreds of broken frames. So I'd dig through there and I'd cut off the hinges, I'd solder on a plate, drill some holes, and I'd mount that to the wooden sides that I'd made. The first ones were pretty ordinary, of course, but, as time went, they became really quite nice and refined. And then I, of course, added a bit of artistic flair occasionally and different inlays and things. And so really kind of just fused quite well together at that time, not being able to access everything automatically. And, it kind of forced me to look at what resources I already had. So,
and that's the beauty. I mean, finding your collective in some capacity with regards to common professionals around the world. Obviously, the internet facilitated that, but you also knew what you were looking for. You knew what you were after, I think. And once you found them, you were able to make use of that. And I guess that gets then highlighted even further by the fact that, when you are limited in resources, you will look at opportunities in ways that other people won't, and you'll make something of that opportunity. So when your mate's dad came to you with this product or with this furniture that was no longer needed, and it's like, well, hold on, how can I repurpose this and reuse this? And I guess that is also the essence of sustainability. And it's something that I guess we'll see more and more as we get sort of further on in our conversation with how these elements have all tied up to, I guess, what you're doing today. But if we go back to sort of the workshop and the craftsmanship component, when you're making a frame, and I guess I've never really made a frame, so I don't know your courses on that side with regards to but with regards to making a frame, for me, I think you'd be so much wastage in what you're doing because, you're obviously starting off with a block of some sort. And again, I could be wrong here, but you're stripping it away and then there are all these offcuts and all these pieces. And there is that element of just, throwing things away. So when you're in the workshop, how are you combining the craftsmanship of getting the best out of the material that you're using and balancing that with the sustainability? And in doing that, what lessons have you learned that I guess you've taken away from that?
Well, one of the huge benefits to working in a communal workshop is you have access to all these different people of different professions and skills and things like that. And as I said, I grew up with a garage that always had bits of wood around, because we'll need that little offcut of 2x4 at some point in time, And because materials and things were hard to get, I kept everything. Anybody comes into my workshops, they'll know there's always boxes and boxes of bits. So, I would keep it, like this is an example of a frame. So that's the frame, that's the waste, that's not including the lenses, the lens hole. And so that really kind of pushed me to think more about, well, what do we do with this kind of thing? And I started by, making jewelry with soft cuts and things. So I've made wooden rings for a long time and what I would do is I would consider how I would cut the material so that I had the right size of cut that I could use to make a ring or that I could use to make a coast or, whatever it was that I have to be making. And as I learned more and more about the materials that we use in optics, particularly acetate, I learned how amazing some of these materials were. And I did a lot of stuff with some jewelers. And the jewelry industry is one of the most sustainable industries in the world because, what they don't use, they remelt down and they make the next ring out of it. It's not even a thought. Like, of course you're going to keep what you're not using and reuse it. That's why wouldn't you? And I looked at our industry and I looked at the way that things were manufactured and I'm like, well why aren't we? And so I was, again, you come back to the beauty of these workspaces where you have access to all these interesting people. And, I came across a bunch of people who were involved in the precious plastic movement and recycling plastics and other materials. So in combination, and I'm looking at the frames that I'm making thinking, well, there's metal and there's plastics. Why can't they be recycled? And how can I get involved in that? And how can I do something with that? And, makers around the world, same thing. They're all thinking as they've got these boxes stacked with leftover materials. I don't want to just throw it out. So because as a small maker, that's precious to you. You bought that as well. You spent a lot of money and time and things to get that. Why can't you reuse it?
And I feel like that's a perfect, lead into what you're currently doing in and amongst many other things. And the shirt that you're representing today is what I'm going to ask you about next, which is, for those that can't see, a Spexcycle. So can we talk about Spexcycle? What inspired you to create it? I guess we've had a little bit of an insight as to what maybe helped inspired you, but can you talk about the program? How does it work? What's it about?
Yeah. So, as you said, we were talking about material wastage and things like that in manufacturing. And I was, in a workspace where recycling of plastics was a thing that was done there, working with jewelers and things. And geez, and I think it was literally the bottom drawers. And every store has a bottom drawer or a back cupboard that is overflowing with frames that are being given back, broken frames, temples, things like that. And, being in Australia, having to import everything that we use, I'm like, well, we have all this material here. So over time, I kind of started looking at it and I contacted some people and I'm like, how do we recycle acetate? And, people laugh. Why would you recycle acetate? Like it's a difficult job. To myself, well, yeah, you are going to have to do that, but we should do that. And I remember sitting one day, I'm a bit of a maths person. I count a lot, and I was thinking about how many frames we were selling in the practice that I was working in. And then I was talking to someone who was talking about how many independent practices there were. And then I was thinking about all the spectators and the chains practices. And I'm thinking, geez, there's got to be, 2,500, 3,000 stores all selling, 2,500 pairs of glasses every year. Like that is epic. During COVID, I was doing some metal fabrication as our industry changed. And then I'm noticing the safety glasses and I myself was putting them on, they're getting scratched. Next pair. And so I decided at that point that I wanted to do something about it. And it's a complicated project because you've got, how do you collect them? How do you collect all the glasses? How do you encourage people to bring them back in for collection and recycling? How easy is it to break them down? How labor intensive that is? And then also, how do you support that financially? Because you're talking about something that requires a lot of manual labor, a lot of human involvement to do. So I set about working out how to do that and learning how to recycle the acetates and learning about what materials the frames were made out of that could be recycled and what that process was. And there was a great movement called the Precious Plastic Movement at that time, which was a big open source platform basically saying to people, here's how you can recycle bottle tops and old toys and, DVDs and whatever else. And here's machinery and here's systems. And here's how you can create a collection system so that you can source this material and kind of encourage people to bring them to you. And I thought to myself, as the industry was kind of taking up sustainability, bioacetates were a thing, contact lens collection was starting to become a thing. And I thought, I think optometrists would want to be part of it. So a small group of us got pulled together and we developed a program called Spexcycle, which we have collection bins that we put into people's stores, into your practice. And what we want you to do and what is starting to happen, we've had really amazing kind of uptake by the stores that are participating in the pilot program is, just like with multi-coats, what we used to do before they became norm, we say at the end of the sale, don't forget to bring in any unused pairs of spectacle frames that you've got so that we can collect them for recycling, and then the goal is that when they come back in to pick up their new specs, they bring in the pairs they're not using anymore, pop them into the nice little collection box, and then they're shipped back to us. And then we go through the painstaking process of breaking all those down into different materials, identifying materials, and then remanufacturing them back into frames. And it's what we call a closed loop system. So the idea is that the loop has to start somewhere, of course, which is by, getting people to give us the old frames they've collected, whether it's dead stock, used frames, manufacturing waste, demo lenses. There's an epic amount of demo lenses that just get thrown in the bin. And so they send them back to us, and we're now in the process of breaking them down and remanufacturing them back into new spectacle frames. In order to do that, and that closed loop with all this material, we've created a brand called Objekt Eyewear, which is made purely out of recycled acetate from the collections, which, that was one of the, and so that is how we're able to facilitate it. And we wanted it to make it as easy to access and be a part of as humanly possible. So, we didn't want people to be like, oh, I have to buy an expensive collection bin, or I have to spend a fortune on things like that. Well, the way that we can help with that is, when you become a part of that and you say stock the Objekt Eyewear, everyone that you're selling is contributing to us being able to recycle more and more of the optical industry's waste. And so our intention is, of course, to just slowly work through the different materials and to make it as normal as humanly possible to recycle.
There'll obviously be links to both of those initiatives, programs in the show notes. And I do want to speak about it a little bit more. I think what I really admire about what you're doing there is the fact that you're thinking about the whole process. It's not just as simple as, wanting to do it. It's like, well, you got to think of the mechanics as to how are we going to collect them and what's the dialogue that the optometrists or the optical dispensers or the retail staff, how are they communicating it? Because it doesn't just happen. And I feel like that thought process of from the beginning through to the end is great. Even again, to the point where you've got Objekt Eyewear now. So it's like you have a purpose for the whole thing and it's that closed loop. So that, I think doing something like that makes it really noticeable and understandable with regards to what the purpose of it all is. And people then can see that from the beginning by getting through to the end eyewear, which is Objekt, as you've mentioned. How does that process work? Okay, can you speak to that a little bit more? Obviously, when you must collect all these frames and you have all these, pieces. Again, it's probably very complicated, but I guess in as simply as you possibly can explain it, what does that look like? And I guess the frames come to you and then what happens?
Yeah, there's a lot of complexities to it, but it is able to be broken down quite simply. So we've got a pilot program. I think we've got about 45 or 50 fantastic stores who've been able to kind of jump on and say, we want to help you get this off the ground. Let's work together to do it. They send us through a box. We try to get them to wait till they've got kind of decent shoebox size. So we're not always just freighting things backwards and forwards. So generally we get kind of 40 or 50 frames in at a time from a store. And as soon as that arrives, we weigh it, we count it, and we separate it. At the moment, we, obviously using a lot of the acetate. So complete acetate frames get separated, combination frames get separated, metal frames get separated, demo lenses, prescription lenses, and then unknown. There's a lot of stuff that we, have to work out what materials. And so that happens straight away because we have a unique tracking system that we're putting it into so that you can follow the journey of what you've sent in for recycling all the way back to the frame batch that it goes out in. So that recording is extremely important for us. It's about being able to be transparent and build trust in the process that we're developing and, wanting people to not be afraid to support it. So we have a sorting room where we spend a lot of time neck deep in broken frames and frames of all descriptions. And so that gets separated, batched and kind of noted. We group all that together and then we have to sort colors and confirm materials and things like that. And then the frames go into kind of a breaking down process where we have to remove components and make sure that the material we're stripping down from it is usable in the remanufacturing process. So we go through that. So it is quite a journey and quite labor intensive, that part of the process. Once we get that, we break the frames down even further into really raw materials, into small components of acetate or small components of metals or whatever it is. And then we have some proprietary tech that we use to remanufacture that material back into the raw materials that we make frames out of. And that again continues the cycle or the circular process as well, because whatever waste we create, we're moving towards minimal waste. We don't believe in zero waste because everything creates some kind of waste. So it's just about as minimal waste as we can. And what waste we do create, we reuse again. So acetate in particular and the metals, they're really beautiful materials that can just be, reused over and over and over again. So we have a really complicated system or cumbersome system because everything we make has probably twice as much work as a normal frame being made, because it has to be broken down and rebuilt and remanufactured into a new frame.
And with Objekt Eyewear in particular, like, what's the philosophy of the brand, other than the sustainability, which obviously is really strong? When it comes to frame collections and brands, there's always like a theme or a style or, a collection of some type. How do you manage that, considering that you kind of don't know what you're going to get, so to speak? Or do you know roughly what you're kind of going to get, and can you allow for that? Or is it a matter of just seeing what's in front of you and then saying, okay, based on what we're seeing, we can start a collection within the range that looks like this? Or is it just a matter of everything being so bespoke and individual that there is nothing like that?
This was an interesting challenge because, in order to fund Spexcycle, we need to have the range of eyewear that was going to be appealing. And because without that, there's no funding to be able to do all the labor and cumbersome kind of work. And so Objekt Eyewear as a brand, so having a design background, I'm a big fan of furniture design. And so when we were kind of deciding, I didn't want it to be just a sustainable brand. I wanted it to kind of stand on its own. So eyewear is a unique object because it's artistic, it's fashion, and it's medical. And we were talking about, and I kept referring to it as these objects and things like that. And I was sitting looking at my 1,000 chair designs book, and I was thinking, well, why don't we call it Object? Because each one will be a unique object. Each batch will have a uniqueness to it. So that's where the name came about. And the spelling is the Scandinavian spelling for it, which they're the kings of clean design.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where Object was born. So I wanted styles that represented kind of periods of interesting design, from, classic rectangles to a nice, neat cat's eye. And we just started building it from there. As I'm designing it, and I was designing the keyholes. Keyholes are not unique, but ours is designed around the bulldog clips that I use to hold all the paper for the designs. That's so, awesome. We take that shape and we kind of incorporate that into it. There is challenges around color and around consistency and what you're going to get, because that's determined by what people give to recycling, right? So we wait till we have enough of a color and material to be able to produce, a few hundred or more of them. And then we might mix and play with that. And, there are levels of prediction, because I know that brown is a really popular color in Australia. We suspected that we would get a lot of black, brown, and a few other colors. And we've been pretty good with our projections and predictions. I was shocked. We managed to get a lot of really amazing blues. You can see this is one that I was playing with. So we've got a really cool blue color that out of nowhere we had enough to make, quite a decent quantity. And I was like, oh, well, this is great. So we can kind of play with this. And so it's kind of become a bit of fun, a bit of a game to kind of work out, what colors we can create. And then that, how can you then create shapes and styles that you're not going to know what color it's going to end up.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And that from a practices perspective, because I've worked as a dispenser for 25 years, that's fun. If you can go to your clients and say, well, this is the new color in Object 1, and there's only 100 of this color that's available, and it may never ever be available again, because that exact mix is unique now to this collection batch. It's been a fun challenge.
Yeah, that concept of scarcity is also what makes it valuable too, in somewhat, because it's like, this is limited, this is not unlimited, and it can't be mass produced, and there's a uniqueness to it. And the other thing I was thinking as you were saying that is, it made me think of something interesting, which is invariably when, and I'm assuming this because I'm not a frame designer, obviously I've had some exposure to picking frames and the like, but nothing to the level that you're doing. But obviously one of the biggest challenges is trying to pick colors and things that you think will work. And working with what you're working with, and that's just a thought that I had as you were saying, is like you're dealing with stock that's already been sold. So in some ways, there's already a little bit of a track record with it, because the stock has sold prior. So it's passed a test of some sort. So that you're working with a product that has worked, as opposed to say bringing in a brand new color or if that's possible, or something that's totally, like totally different. It's like, in this instance, we're starting with a base, which we know has actually worked and sold, and we're evolving from that too. So I guess, again, just a different thought. Whether that makes a difference or not to anything, I'm not sure, but it's just an interesting little thought that I had there.
Yeah, I think it does. It's like, on one hand, it may actually make things a little tougher because you're like, I know this sold at some point. What we do with it now are people going to like what we do with it? How we take this color and how we interpret it. So the pressure's on there, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. But based on sort of your experience and seeing what you do, I feel like you've got that covered. But in any case, if we're looking at Spexcycle and Objekt, I guess because they do work hand in hand, like there can't be, I think there's not one Spexcycle might exist on its own potentially, but I think the way that you're creating it and it's being created is that they do work hand in hand. And I think that synergy is really, it's unique and it's different. And I think it'll be, the reason why it's successful, in my opinion. But I guess when we're speaking about it and the broader conversation about sustainability, how important is it? And what would you like to say to sort of optometrists or dispensers or anyone that's thinking about this with regards to, any insights that you might have, or I guess the benefits for doing it?
I think the big thing would be, why not do it? From our perspective, we've certainly done everything and are doing everything we can to make it as easy to participate in as possible. We don't expect you don't have to purchase Objekt to be part of the sustainability movement in the industry. We love you to, of course, because that helps that circle. But why wouldn't you? When you look at the amount of waste that we create, because as a lens manufacturer yourself, you can't use recycled materials. You've got to use virgin materials because the lenses have got to be right, and you shouldn't not be allowed to do that because people want good quality lenses. They want good sight. And so I guess what I say is, with Objekt, we're trying to show you that participating in sustainability doesn't have to be cheap. It doesn't have to be, bad quality or anything special. It can just be something that is part of the frame and the manufacturing process that is just normal at some point in time. And the more that we get involved in it, the more kind of sustainability becomes the norm. The more that everybody has the yellow recycling bin, it's just normal to separate your cardboards and your plastics out from your landfill waste. So I guess what I'd say is it'd be harder to change. The more that we recycle, the easier it becomes to be a normal part of the frame, and the materials that we use. Many of us have got kids and generations ahead, and the better that we can consider the resources that we are wasting and throwing out, the better chance our future generations and people have of, being able to continue to make cool things without worrying about running out of materials or the damage it does to the environment over time.
Yeah. I think there's obviously, and there has been for a while now, a movement towards that. Sustainability is very much a key part of society with regards to how we think about things. And so having it brought into optics in this way, I think is really positive. And I think the initiatives are awesome. And so congratulations on that. And I guess, the work that you're doing in that regard, it's really, it is awesome. Like I mentioned, I guess going forward, where do you see the future of sustainable eyewear? Like obviously, you're at the infancies of what you're doing. I guess, what are your visions? What do you see happening in the coming years, sort of whether it's, 5 years, 10 years, like how do you see this evolving?
I think that we're really primed for this to be a fairly normal thing eventually. So I guess what I see happening is the more people get behind it, the more chance people like myself do to research and develop better and simpler ways to do it. And, from the personal perspective, I'd love to see a point in time where people don't really talk about sustainability as being a special part of its manufacturing. It's just considered in what's manufacturing, as an eyewear manufacturer or whatever, lens manufacturer, at some point in time, it's just expected that you will have a component of genuine sustainability, resource recovery, minimal waste production, whatever it is just not, and it's the odd to not be participating in that. And I don't think you have to be extreme left or, extreme greeny to kind of think that that's important. So I guess that's what I'd like to see. And what I actually do see is I actually genuinely see an industry that kind of already does it, like to a degree. Everybody that I've worked for has kept boxes, has kept plastic bags and reused them, So it's not like I don't think we're dealing with an industry that is adverse to it at all. I think it's just about making it accessible. And I think that's what I'd like to see, is it just be more accessible. I'm sure as a lens manufacturer,
Right.
you'd love to see, a point where you could access materials that also did that.
Absolutely. And like you said, I think the industry is already, they're already prone to doing things like this. I mean, I see it all the time with the packaging that comes back to us and different components that can be reused. I mean, it's not a throwaway thing. So whether it's the boxes, whether it's the packaging that the framelits are sent in, it's always sent back and it's always reused. And so there is an element of that where, you can, if you can, why throw it out? And I think that's something that we do as an industry can do quite well. I think the accessibility to things like this are awesome. And I think the purpose that you bring to it with regards to that full circle concept, I think just adds more value to it and makes it more relatable. And, when you said something you said earlier was this whole trust factor, because, I think that there is a little bit of a perception, especially when you speak broadly about recycling. Like, I mean, we've all heard about, this is just from what I've heard. I mean, yellow recycling bin just gets all collected in the same area, whether it's Red Cycle, which obviously was a company that I think that the shopping networks worked with, and there was obviously some conjecture there and some adversity there that they've dealt with. I think the fact that you're saying, well, we're tracking everything and this is actually going to this particular product, and it does give people confidence to say, well, you know what, this is making a difference. I can tell that it is. And in doing so, I think it will just encourage more people to be part of it. So I think you really thought about that quite well and in a quite a holistic manner. So I feel like making it accessible, making it relatable and relative to the industry are sort of all ticks from sort of what we're saying.
Yeah, that's definitely been part of it. And the other part that, aside to the trust component, because there is a level of greenwashing that does occur in the world, and we were very much want to participate in that. So we're working to make everything as transparent and trackable and traceable as possible. But when you talk about the fact that you can see what batches material go into, it's also about making people part of that batch. So, when you as a store know you've contributed to this batch of frames kind of thing, and your customers who've who collected and given their frames for recycling, and you can say to them, well, hey, these frames ended up in this batch of eyewear. So it's also just about kind of allowing everyone to be part of it.
Yeah. And the thing I love about things like that is because I obviously think about things quite deeply from time to time. And, there's no, I mean, even in the future, you could have something where like a store sends you all their frames and maybe you keep their frames for them and then maybe provide a collection for them where it's like, well, we've got a collection here of our recycled frames from our store that we've reintroduced into the store. And again, it's just an idea that's popped into my head, but
the more people recycle and the more people send to us, the more capacity we have to do cool things like that.
Yeah, that's it. Cool.
Yeah, so we really want stores to jump on board and come up with these concepts as well, because like I said, if store could collect that many frames, well, we can definitely do something cool with them. There's a lot of steps between there and now.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. That's just my sort of, blue sky kind of thinking, But again, there are things like this that it just starts that, like, said, your first thing is never generally good. You've got to do it a few times and you sort of, you change, you pivot, and it leads to something in the future. And I think, what's important now is that, this initiative started. Obviously, we're helping hopefully sort of spread the message in that regard and encourage people to be a part of it. And I guess in light of that, if listeners do want to get involved with this, with Spexcycle, with Objekt Eyewear, how can they find out more information? How can they reach out to you?
Look, it's pretty simple. So we're on all the socials. So we're on Instagram and Facebook, obviously. So you can jump on and send us a DM there or follow, and you can kind of see the progress of what we're doing. The other way is if you jump onto either of our websites, objekteyewear.com or spexcycle.com.au. There's a contact page on both of those. So you can hop in your store information, your contact details, and send that through. And Heather will contact you by phone or email and explain the way. It's very simple. Send out a collection box, send out some information, and we start the process. It's really,
and that's Australia-wide, correct? I'm assuming that's Australia.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely, Australia-wide. Or otherwise, you can always just email us at hello@spexcycle.com.au, and that'll come through to us. And it may not be me that answers it because I'm generally in the warehouse deep in frames and things, but Heather will probably be the one that answers you and sorts all that out for you.
And as I mentioned earlier, all that information will be in the show notes. So if anyone is interested, just to check in with the show notes, and you can get all those links and find out more about what's happening. Another question I had, it's pretty clear that you had a bit of you had a passion for creativity and design, and I feel, and I'm not sure how you feel about it, but it's getting less and less. So if there is someone that's listening to this episode that is thinking about becoming a frame designer, or wanting to do small batch, or look at that as an option, because to be fair, the mechanics of that are probably, like I said, are not as prevalent as they were 15, 20, 30 years ago. How can people start that process, or what does that look like for somebody that's interested in sort of pursuing a career in design or in frame design?
It seems pretty daunting at first when you think about it, because, we always imagine these big design houses and, everybody's seen The Devil Wears Prada kind of thing, So, it can seem pretty daunting. Look, I run a kind of condensed workshop where people can come along and they go through a really simple process of making a spectacle frame or a sunglass from start to finish. And that's probably a nice way to kind of get a little bit of a hands-on to the material. You're in a workshop where frames are made. And, obviously I talk through the process and talk a little bit about that in the industry. That's a good way to start. Design, there's some great eyewear design books out there, history books and things like that. There's amazing eyewear by a guy called Martin, who runs the Eyewear Forum, and he's got a collection of big names as well as interesting, unique, boutique kind of names of eyewear out there. And I think from there you start looking at the brands and you start looking at where they theme themselves, kind of thing. Like you talked a little bit about this before, kind of. So when you see a frame in these books and you go, okay, you can jump onto their website, you can see a bit of the story of what they've created, and, learning more about that. It is industrial design in its essence, eyewear manufacturing or eyewear design. But I'm not sure that these days, with the amount of access to amazing machines and software and things, that you need to go down the path of doing an industrial design course. I think it can be as simple as, learning a little bit about what you want to create, having some chats to me. There's some other great eyewear designers in Australia. We have some fantastic ones, Jonathan Skeets, Peter Coombs, Fritz Frames, Roger Henley. Like to name a few, there's Vanyard. There's a whole bunch of really amazing Australian designers and manufacturers.
I think the good thing is, making this known also gets it out there. And so if people are interested, knowing that there is a little bit of a path like that, can just help somebody with their next steps if they, they're interested by it. But Chris, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed our chat. It's been a little bit different, but really unique. And I appreciate your time. Congratulations again, Spexcycle and Objekt Eyewear. I think they're great initiatives, and I hope they keep awesome goals for you. So thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And if I might add, anybody who is interested, we are going to be at Odna Fair this year. Actually putting together a really cool little mixology display. So we won't be mixing cocktails, but we'll be mixing something else up on the stand. So do come and see us and
absolutely
have a chat.
Yep. No, awesome. All right, Chris. All right, buddy. Take care.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
Stay connected by subscribing to The Focused View and visiting our website www.thefocusedview.com.au for additional resources and episode summaries. We look forward to your company again in our next episode. Until then, keep focused. I'm Michael Nasser. Bye for now.